So in this video, I'm going to talk about cloning, which is a way to reproduce areas of your image. You can use this either kind of like copying and pasting to make a selection, but you're going to be painting it in instead of using a selection tool. Or you can also think of this as a way to cover up parts of your image that you don't want. The cloning tool is over here in the retouching section of your toolbar. And if I click and I hold it down, I see that there's another tool in there, pattern stamp tool. And that's not the tool that you want to use. You want to make sure it's on the first one, clone stamp tool. So the way this clone stamp tool works is I go over to my image. I'm going to first show you sort of the destructive way to do it, and then we're going to talk about the non-destructive way to do it, the way I want you to do it. So let's say I want to reproduce this blue butterfly. I need to set my source, which is tell Photoshop where I'm going to start copying my blue butterfly. And I do that by holding the Alt key down, and you'll notice that my brush now actually becomes a bullseye. And I haven't done anything yet. I'm holding the Alt key down, it becomes a bullseye, and I'm going to pick a point where I want to start copying and then just click with my mouse. And now I'm going to let go of both my mouse and the Alt key. And I'm going to move up here, and as I'm moving around, mind you, I'm not holding down on my mouse. As I'm moving around, I can see a little sample of what I have just selected to be my source. So I'm going to move up here. Now I'm clicking with my mouse and I am painting in another copy of that butterfly. So it really is like I've just selected it and copied and pasted it. I'm going to go through those steps again, but let's talk about what happened. I put this onto my background, which is destructive. So now if I wanted to move that butterfly around, I would have to make a selection, copy it, and paste it out and put it onto its own layer. So I'm going to open up my history panel and go back. This time, still on my clone stamp tool, I'm going to go up to the options bar, and here's a couple of things we've already looked at where I could adjust the size, the opacity, and all the way down here where it says sample. This is such an important step. Yours probably says current layer. We're going to choose sample all layers. So what that means is I can create a new blank layer, and even though I'm on this blank layer, it's going to sample from all layers, which in this case is only one layer, and it's the layer below. If I have it on sample current layer, and I try to do this, nothing's coming out because there's nothing on layer 1. So I need to make sure it's on either current and below, because in this case that would work, or all layers, and I'm just going to use all layers. So now I'm here, and I'll do the same thing. I'm going to move over to the middle of my butterfly, hold the Alt key down, it becomes a bullseye, click. That's the spot I've just grabbed as a source. Let go of both the mouse and the Alt key, and now I can click up wherever I want, and holding down my mouse, paint it in. And I now have a new butterfly. I can move it around, I can do Control T, and it's its own independent object. It's just kind of like I made a selection and copy and pasted it. All right, so let's talk about this in a couple of other images, other ways that you could use it. Continuing to talk about cloning, I'm going to do another example here to show you how oftentimes you want to use cloning to cover up something that you don't want there or to reproduce something. So in this image, for example, I'm going to turn off the layer I already have cloned. I wanted to cover up the little bit of the railing here that didn't have the towel stripes. I like the way the image looks a little bit more ending with the towel stripes. So I'm going to get rid of that layer and step backwards so we can do it together. I'm going to create a new blank layer, take my clone stamp tool, go up to the options bar, and make sure it says sample all layers. I do want to make sure I'm a little bit more zoomed in. So since the towel ended with a blue stripe, I'm going to clone the white stripe over onto this area. So I'm going to clone. The first thing I have to do is to set my source. So I Alt and then click up at the top. I always like to start at an edge. I think it's a lot more effective and you're going to be happier with the results than if you start in the middle. As I have let go of my mouse, I see what I'm dragging around is a sample of the area that I set as my source. So I'm going to try to align it to where I think the towel would continue over onto the left edge, And as I click and I drag down, I can also see a crosshair. It's a little faint on this screen, but if you look to see the white area of the towel, you should also be able to see the crosshair, and that is showing me the area that I am sampling from. So you kind of have to look in two different spots. I'm not just looking at the area I'm cloning into, like where I'm painting and putting the new. I'm also looking to see what I am cloning. And that will be a little bit more evident in the next video of why you need to really pay attention. So that looks pretty good, but just like selections, cloning is often a three-step process. I might want to touch up the blue a little bit and extend that down. So I'm going to resample, Alt-click, and come down here and just sort of make this area of the blue a little bit darker, and perhaps continue to Alt-click. So let's look at the before and the after. And I could do the same thing over here on this other image. Let's go to another image I have here. In this image, I'll show you the original. A couple of things were done to this image. One was just simply working on the color saturation and adjustments. I'll just bring that layer back up. But the other two layers are cloning in to add green to the background, simply because like this, the background, having it as two different types of background, the cement that's over here and the leaves, it's a little bit distracting. So I wanted to completely engross her in all of these leaves. So this is another example of cloning. And this is a perfect example of cloning and really treating your clone like a paintbrush. So I'm going to make sure I have my clone tool. I'm on sample all layers. And the way I would approach cloning something like this, by the way, you notice that as I'm moving this around, I'm still dragging the source from my last image. So you can clone between images. So I'm going to make my brush a little smaller because it's a bit distracting. So the way I look at this is as if I was trying to paint it. I'm going to set my mouse into perhaps like the bottom of one of these leaves. Alt, click, come over here and start painting it in. And I don't have a very large area to be able to clone from. As you'll see, I quickly start getting the edge of my picture. And I also don't want to clone too much because you're quickly going to see the patterns and the repetition. So I'm going to let go and I'm going to go back over. So this is the point where I always think of cloning more like painting. It's like I'm going to dip my paint into the paintbrush again. And I'm going to take another section. Perhaps I'll come right over here and try to get these leaves. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to overlap because that's really the way that it would look in nature. They're not going to be these straight little lines. And I want to be careful. I just got a little bit of that blue from her leaves and I need to go back and clone there. So this is the point you're going to watch where I really need to make sure that I'm not just looking at the area I'm cloning, I'm also looking to see my source, because if I keep going right now, I'm suddenly, if you look at my source, the crosshair over there, I'm cloning in her dress, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to do Control Z and go backwards. So let's pick another spot over here perhaps and start cloning that in and get a little bit of those kind of leaves going on. Bring that in. And you have to be careful because when you have some leaves that have a very bright color, for example, the bright yellow ones, if you reproduce them too much, you're just really going to start seeing patterns. And so the point is you just keep going back and resetting your source. And you want to try to get into different spots, and you often overlap the areas because what you just don't want is to get to where it looks exactly like you just made a copy and paste selection. You want it to look a little bit more natural than that. So you just keep going and going over here and setting your source. Now for up here though, because there's a depth of field, the images, the green that's back there is a little bit smaller. You don't want to set your source from here. You'd want to set your source from another area that has the small sort of out of focus greens as well. Okay, so sometimes when you're cloning, like in this example, it's as simple as you set your source and then you trace down. But other times when you're working with the clone tool, you really think of it as a paintbrush. Go dip your paint into that area and paint in some of those leaves and see how that looks. And then perhaps go back over here and dip in a little bit more, cover up a little bit of a mistake, and so on and so forth. Just kind of keep going back. So the main thing about cloning is to make sure that you are working on separate layers. So this is completely non-destructive, and I have my original there. You might also want to work in multiple layers. So that way, perhaps if you want to move any of the objects that you've cloned, I could now transform them. Anything that I have on those layers, I could transform, I could rotate, I could make smaller, larger, anything like that. So it's kind of like making a selection, but I think of it a little bit more painterly than making a simple selection. But this is a great way to erase parts of your image, or to make parts of your image look like they've disappeared, but to do it actually non-destructively, so they're still there.